this is kind of exciting for me. I'm French from Paris, but I'm in what I consider to be a better French town, Montreal. So bonjour, Montreal. But I'm going to do my talk in English, which actually is probably going to make it a little more coherent since I've never actually done big data or grosses données in French. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to talk about the experience. So I actually come from the startup world. This is my first big company, and I actually worked in the B2B world for about 10 years before going to grad school again and then joining Thomson Reuters. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of a background about what we do. And in this new company, actually, one of the things I've been doing is partnering with startups. So I figured since I've been on both sides, I would talk a little bit about sort of what the market looks like around information technologies, information service, what big data is doing to it, and a little bit of a sort of heuristics about how to sell to the enterprise. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Thomson Reuters, and that's a good example of a company you might want to sell to. We're actually partnering with a bunch of startups right now in the big data space and turning them into vendors, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this, but just a little bit about who we are. So there is 55,000 employees. We're in lots of different countries. And what we serve, we call our market professionals. So that includes people in the financial and risk markets, like basically traders, investment bankers, trying to help big financial institutions manage risk. And we also serve lawyers and people in the legal market with legal services products. And we also have a product called FindLaw that helps you identify the right lawyer. And in Canada, I think we have a product called Cars Law. And we have a tax and accounting business, again, another vertical of professionals. And IP and Science is a conglomerate of things like trademark services, patent services, web of knowledge is a product we sell to academics and scientists. And then, of course, we have the journalist and Reuters News, and that's 2,800 journalists in 20 languages around the world, and they're my colleagues that make me really proud. So a little about me. I live in Boston, and I just started a data innovation lab. I just actually had my first 4 team members start on Monday. And essentially, our mission is to do innovation with data, not only the massive data set that Thomson Reuters has, but as well with customer data, open data, social media data, and really figure out what to do with that. And as part of this, we're also working with startups where we feel the technology is really helping us hit that data innovation. So, and I'm running this a little bit like I know how to run something, so it's kind of my little internal startup. And I'll talk a little bit about processes. So that's about me, that's about Thomson Reuters. So the enterprise opportunity with big data. So one of the reason I wanted to do this talk is that before I started a lab, I was primarily focused on external innovation and connecting with startups. And when the startups were not already in a vertical that made sense to us, so they were not already creating legal technology or they were trying to handle fintech, a lot of them had some really good ideas, but they were applying them in perhaps not the best revenue model. And the reason was that the technology was really cool, and sometimes there were really smart grad students in machine learning or natural language processing, so they applied it to what they knew, which was, well, I'll apply it to my email box, or I'll apply it to blogs. And actually, there would be like a really great opportunity to help the drug delivery process in life sciences, for instance. But that's not something they had the exposure to. So I think the enterprise, when I call the enterprise or the professional opportunity, is really big. It might not be the easier one to have a personal intuition on, but it actually can mean a lot of money. And assuming that not everything is ad revenue supported, then that's another way to find a business model that's viable. And so that's what I wanted to kind of delve into a little bit. Okay, so this is Mark. Actually, I met Mark at DataBeat in San Francisco a couple of weeks ago, and I thought he had a really good point about what's still unsolved in big data, and it's the variety problem, right? So a lot of the technology we see today are all about selling more ads or making better understanding about recommendation and doing BI, and that data set tends to be, largely speaking, a little bit more coherent. But there is a lot of insights to be gained with big data that relies on much more diverse data set, and that's an unsolved problem. That's a real pain point. So Mark, who's looking at doing really cool things in the drug discovery at Novartis, his big problem is the variety of data he's dealing with within Novartis. And fundamentally, that's the bottleneck to do the really good, cool things that you could do with big data and start really living up to the buzzword. So I'm going to use one segment of our entire space to talk about what kind of cool things you could do with big data. And so this stack is just for the financial area, but basically it kind of echoes the idea that the hard part of solving the data problem to support cool analytics is not solved. So Andy is actually the CEO of a startup with which we're working right now called Tamer, and their solution is part of this solving that problem of connecting the data in a way that enables you to do the cool analytics. And some of the cool analytics that are listed here in our fintech space are all the way from doing text analytics and just doing better search on text. Text is something that I feel like most startups haven't really been tackling. And that's actually a great source of insights in the big data space. Then this traditional sort of data science definition, which is about predictive analytics and algorithms that help you trigger an action. And then in the fintech space, there's actually more sophisticated things about mimicking human decisions. So I'm bringing more data. I don't want to go through much in detail, but what I like about this chart, we just did this study with a bunch of people in the capital market space, so big banks, people with very deep pockets. And what you'll find out is that they haven't even started understanding how powerful unstructured data can be for them, right? They know it's important, but not yet how much. So when I look at this last point, unstructured data, and I see a 9 as somewhat important, that means that it's early on. We're at the very beginning of being able to understand how to reap the value from all this unstructured data floating in the enterprise. That means that eventually, and actually in some cases we know already, they're trying to figure out how to structure that unstructured text, make it useful, and start running analytics on it. So it's just one lens to talk about the fact that we're at the very early stage. And I think what you'll see, which is the other part of the survey, is that they're very likely to invest in it. So that means they're going to be spending money to solve that problem. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how we worked with startups, how we feel startups have done well selling to a big, complicated company like ours, and some of the feedback I collect when I work with them and how they sell to our customers in the enterprise space. So the good news is I think large companies are changing the way they do business, that it's no longer just about doing it all themselves and doing it in the R&D lab, and the R&D people might talk to a startup, but it's a long lead to turning them into a real enterprise vendor. I think there's a new model that's emerging, and we're certainly working that way, where we're trying to identify a startup with which we can really test out their technology, prove it out, help them prove out their business model or the value proposition. And we did this with this company called Tamer, where we came in before they even launched and helped them test things out. And if they have a really good solution, then we can quickly figure that out. I think something that's really important in this statement is that for large companies, innovation is actually a new business outside of R&D. That means they need to figure out how to do it, and that means that there's an opportunity for startups to play a role in helping them get there. So I think that's a good thing, and I don't know if every big company is already at that sort of realization that corporate innovation is changing to a more open model, but I certainly think the trend is happening, and at least people like me are trying to make it happen. And the other good news is, well, if you're trying to raise money, I think software is eating the world. So that big blue blob here is VC funding in the US in Q1. And that's $4 billion that went into the software industry. So it sounds like a pretty good place to go raise money. And I think that's a pretty good example of the kind of things that VCs are interested in investing. Now, all of it is not enterprise software, but that's a good sort of signal of why we still think that that's a great place to be. And here's the problem. That's what it looks like. So I'm a big company, and I'm interested in big data technology, and Matt Turk in New York put this little chart together, and this is all the startups in the space. So the bad news is you're not going to be alone in it. But that means you have to be very crisp in your value proposition, and you have to figure out how to break into this space in a way that helps your customer understand why you're different or what you can do differently. And I think that's one of the things that's the most confusing for a big company is to get these pitches that all sound the same. So we actually a month ago went to San Fran, met with 22 startups, and about half of them told me they were a big data analytics platform, which actually was like, okay, you realize, right? Like 3 other guys just told us that. So, here's my little short list of how to make it work. And I kind of feel like if I'd known that when I was in my little B2B startup, those things would have been probably helpful. So the first one is you're talking to someone at some big company like Thomson Reuters or JP Morgan or Novartis, and you have to distinguish who's passionate versus who can make it happen, that first check from you. And actually, that might not be the same person. So you might just find someone who's just so excited to, by proxy, live up the excitement of your startup, and are just curious to find out what you're doing, either to figure out if they can have where the technology is headed, or to try to duplicate it internally, or just is curious. So that distinction and figuring out how to read the signal with a pretty smart business development or salesperson is kind of important. And once you have that, you might find actually the right person who's got the application for your technology. But who's going to sign that first check for you? And when I talk about the first check, I think that's really important. So one of the things we do when we engage with a startup, even very early stage, is we agree to run a lean experiment, which means that we agree on a sum of money that signals, I'm serious about working with you. You're serious about working with me. I get that like lots of big companies are talking to you, that you're so excited, and that we're both, have a lot of noise in the system. So we're going to make a 3 months lean experiment. We're going to agree on what we're going to test out. I'm going to pay you. You're going to commit some resources. We're going to work on it together. And we're going to come out of it with some learning. You're going to kind of figure out what your value proposition is in the startup. I'm going to find out if what you're delivering actually does what it was supposed to do, or actually was I asking the right question, and so on, and iterate. And so we've been actually running those, what I call lean experiment, in 3 months, or depending, sometimes 6 month segment. So there's a really clear sort of cadence in the early stage evaluation. So sometimes that person that engages you and gives you the first check, and that might be $50,000, $100,000, is actually not the person that turns you into a vendor. And you have to figure out who that is. So in this case, when we worked with some of these big data vendors, I wrote the first check, but I'm not the person that turned them into an enterprise vendor. And I think, again, you have to kind of figure out your stakeholders, what the process is to move from that early stage engagement to becoming actually a vendor. And then I kind of mentioned that, but I mean, you have to understand who you're competing with a little bit. So is it the legacy system that's in-house? Is it the 5 other startups that sound just like you? Is it their own internal R&D, which actually is quite common? Is it another big player that sounds the same? Do I work with the other big player to go to market? And just sort of figure out where you fall into the value chain, and actually use that information for the next person you're going to talk to, the next big enterprise you're talking to. And then, of course, know when to break up when you're not heading anywhere, and then move on and figure out what you learned from it. So in your sense, you're also running this sort of iterative experiments. And this might sound obvious or simple, but I mean, in the last 3 years, I've seen that recipe can really work for a startup, and it's easy to not follow those steps, basically. And that's it. I was planning to have more Q&A, so I kind of figured out I'll stop here. Thanks. Any questions? Yeah.
So when you're building sort of an innovation team within a large organization, how do you handle sort of the cultural differences?
That's a really good question. So I think I don't know if I have all the answers, but I find that so the question is, sorry, I'm repeating your question. So the question was, when you're building an innovation team inside of a large organization, how do you deal with the cultural differences? So I found actually that what seems to work for me in a large organization is the same thing that worked in my startups, which is to have the right leadership and the right person sort of championing. So I worked for founders or CEOs in my startups, even when we're 10 people, that I found to be the right cultural fit for me. So in this case, I work for the CTO, who's really good at setting up the mission of us being able to kind of do what we need to do to succeed. I think there is a lot of similarity in working in a large company as it's just a different boundary around your ecosystem, right? Like when you're a startup, the entire world is the people you have to sell and convince and collaborate with. We have just one more layer. We have the internal customers, they have their own customers, but then there is a multiplying effect of our success, is that we now have a whole sales force that's ready to unload. So far, I think that I've been able to convince myself you can create a culture where you can rapidly iterate and be innovative and be entrepreneurial, or maybe I'm just convinced you're the same person no matter where you work.
But I heard from.
You got your mic.
I wondered if you could tell me anything about Open Calais and Reuters' experience with that, even like where that came from, and did you have the object? First of all, you probably explain to people what it is, if they don't know what it is, and then how that experiment worked, and then also I understand that you're doing some things with linked data.
Sure.
I don't know many businesses that are working with linked data, and I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Okay, so I actually came in after this whole Open Calais initiative, so I'll talk about what that is. So Open Calais is essentially a web service to help you link and I tag. Like if you have a news article, you can go to Open Calais and it'll identify the name of companies and people and help you tell you what they are. So it's a very useful tool in that whole stack of doing text analytics. So like a company like Recorded Future that does all this cool predictive analytics on time series, they use tools like Calais, they use Open Calais to help them create sort of the structure below their analytics. And the story with Open Calais was that we bought a company before I joined that did that kind of text tagging, entity tagging and extracting, and we turned it into this open service that became actually really useful. And I think this is a good example of something that was probably a little early in its timing, and so it was kind of confusing to people inside the company. So now we're actually working and relaunching it and making it a lot better. And it's becoming a lot more interesting. I was talking to a bunch of VCs about how do you make Open Calais, like where Open Calais would fit. And now text analytics is something they're throwing a lot of money at. But I think 3-4 years ago, it was a little soon. So it's a really interesting model where we launched it without having the ability to rapidly iterate on what the model was. And so it kind of launched and confused people. And now we're sort of picking it back up and figuring out what kind of value it would have as an open service. So I think this whole open, quote, anything in enterprise is really new. I think when you're in the startup world, you assume it's just sort of the way it works, but it's still something that's incredibly new and still getting adopted in the large enterprise, and it's kind of exciting to see it happen. So I gave many, many talks internally about open innovation, and I often feel like a big fraud when I do that because I'm thinking like it's obvious, but it isn't. And like talking about what's the difference between open and free, and why open is important, why open source is the way really smart engineers like keep up with technology that you can't live without, and so on. And so I think Open Calais is going to be a really cool new way for us to re-engage with the open community, and we're working on that right now. And your question about linked data, I think there's a woman who works for Tim Berners-Lee at MIT who showed me a Google trend on linked data, and it's picking back up, so we'll see.
Yeah, hi. My name is Raju, and I'm from Tata Consultancy Services. I just wanted to share that we have a very similar model called Co-Innovation Network, where we invite startups, and disruptive innovation is what we identify, and then the overall plan is to see in what way we can partner with them.
Yeah, I actually looked up your website and sort of the write-up about this when we're thinking about models to make it work. And then most of what we did is get rapid feedback from startup founders on what worked. I mean, it's really easy to hear from their experience of all the things they don't like working with big companies and help them with things that work. But yes, Tata's a great model. Great, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.